Hello everyone, and you're very welcome to the session for the Digital Support Services T-Level. And today we'll be looking at the Employer Set project and preparing your students for that assessment. The plan for today is to provide an overview of the Employer Set project, or ESP, before going into each task individually, the requirements, and ideas to support your students. Just some quick introductions. My name is David Kiernan, and I work in the Provider Development Team at NCFE. And our job, our purpose is to support providers with the delivery of our qualifications, understanding the structure, the assessments, anything related to teaching and learning. As my own background and the background of the team is also teaching. And my direct email is shown, but if I'm unavailable, then please do use our general provider development email address. And I'm also joined today by our subject specialist, David Seddon, and I'll let him introduce himself now.
Thanks, David. Hi everybody and welcome to the session. Just before we get started, just a bit about me and my background. I've been with NCFE now for getting on for about 18 months. Prior to this, same as David, I've got a teaching background as well. I worked in further education college for around about the last 20 to 25 years. And through the time there, I've worked with delivering and managing computer science programs. That's in both further and higher education, as well as digital apprenticeships. And as far as T-levels are concerned, I've been working with those since they started early development. Thanks, David.
Cheers, thank you very much for that, David. And just one final thing to note as well is that while we are discussing the assessments and preparing for them today, neither myself nor David Seddon have actually been involved with the assessments or their development because we cannot be part of the assessment team, as this would be a conflict of interest since we speak directly and support providers like yourself. We'll now have a high-level overview of the Employer Set project. So here is the core content, which is broken into the knowledge content, the 12 root elements, and the 3 pathway elements for the Digital Support Services T-Level, and the 4 core skills that students will need to demonstrate. The core assessments are made up of 2 subcomponents: 2 exam papers, which are designed to assess the student's knowledge, and an externally set skills assessment called the Employer Set project. As called this, as the tasks have been developed in conjunction with employers to make them as occupationally realistic as possible. The core assessment will be available in the summer and autumn terms, with the Employer Set project in May and November. When students sit the core assessments for the first time, they need to sit both subcomponents in the same assessment series, so all of the core content can be assessed together. Retakes, however, can be the exam papers only or the Employer Set project only, and it will be their best grade that carries forward. The core assessments are graded A* to E and U or ungraded. And there's one other part of the technical qualification that I want to highlight, which is the General Competency Framework. And this lists the English, Maths, and digital skills competencies that students will also be taught. But these competencies are assessed and are embedded within the specification and the core skills. But it would be useful to develop these further with your students. And English was an aspect highlighted for improvement among students in the summer 2022 series, as was maths. In some cases, the simple application of multiplication, addition, subtraction, or division would have secured marks, or a simple calculation misstep or input error too. So these are essential skills. Do try to develop them further with your students whenever possible. So here's an overview of the ESP tasks, and we will go into each one in turn during this webinar. And this is the general structure and layout of them. And I say general because we do have reviews, take on board provider feedback, and occasionally there's other external factors, such as with the upcoming summer 2022 series and a change of dates due to the King's coronation and resulting bank holiday. but generally, this is how it will run every year. Now for Digital Support Services T-Level, there are actually two employer set project options, depending on which occupational specialism students intend to do. So there's a Digital Support ESP, and there's a Network Cabling and Digital Infrastructure ESP. And the types of tasks are similar for both ESPs, as they are both assessing the same core skills. But there might be some different evidence requirements between the employer set projects. So while it's best for students to sit the ESP related to their occupational specialism, it's not mandatory and doesn't prevent students from taking any of the digital support occupational specialism options. Now, neither of these employer set projects have any pre-release materials for the students, but providers, yourselves, will be given information earlier to allow for system configurations, such as configurations that might be needed for task 1, which is a fault finding / troubleshooting task for digital support. Providers would have to configure systems to replicate the fault, and the evidence can include a troubleshooting document, test plan document, and any other documents such as a firewall configuration document for the network cabling and digital infrastructure ESP. Task 2 is about gathering information in order to make recommendations and solutions for the issue in the brief. And this task has 3 components: research and prepare questions for an interview. Then there's a 10-minute interview, which is audio recorded. And then writing emails following the interview, for example, to a team leader with summary of questions, responses, and issues identified. Task 3 is the production of a project proposal and any other requested documents, for example, a network diagram for the network cabling and digital infrastructure employer set project. And task 4 is also an evaluation with the production of a satisfaction survey and a post-project review document. Now, the very first sitting of the core assessments occurred in the summer 2022, and here are the grade boundaries for the exam subcomponent and the employer set project subcomponent. Now, while there has also been another sitting of the employer set project in the autumn of 2022, so November just gone, those grade boundaries and Chief Examiner's report haven't been published yet, but will be added to QualHub in about a month's time, on the 16th of March 2023. So for easiness, I've also converted the raw mark required in the assessment into a rounded percentage. So we can see that 33% was needed for an E grade in the employer set project. And do remember that grade boundaries can change from one assessment series to another. So these may not be the same grade boundaries for the summer series that's upcoming or for the autumn series just gone, but it should hopefully serve as a useful guide when it comes to measuring students' performance. We're now going to have a closer look at that first task, the fault finding exercise. So task 1 is on a fixed date and time, which for the upcoming summer series will be the 9th of May at 9 AM. Students will have 2.5 hours for this task. But do remember to apply any access arrangements or reasonable adjustments, such as additional time that students may have. And this task is all about students' ability to demonstrate core skill 3, applying a logical approach to solving problems, identifying and resolving faults, whilst recording progress and solutions to meet requirements. For the network cabling and digital infrastructure ESP, being focused around a network issue, and students will be supplied with related network diagrams to help them investigate. For some assessments, such as the digital support employer set project, providers will have to replicate a fault using the information given in the provider guide. So do check this in advance and contact NCFE if you have any issues. The provider guide will be given to you in advance of the assessment to allow you to check and run these configurations. Students will also be allowed access to the internet for research purposes. And for the digital supports students, they would need to produce a test plan and a troubleshooting document. And with the network cabling and digital infrastructure employer set project, students would also produce a test plan, and they need to amend the network diagram supplied. Students are to produce a help guide for end users, for example, using troubleshooting frameworks for resolving the network issues. Some findings from the Chief Examiner's report from the Summer 2022 series found that most students were good at designing and structuring their test plan. But where it was underdeveloped was to describing the logical sequence of tests. And some students do not recognize or demonstrate the need to run tests to verify that the results have been rectified. And for the help guide or troubleshooting task, the majority of students identified the system setting that was causing the issue. However, in some cases, students didn't fully resolve the problem and stopped working on resolutions after they had made a single suggestion. So in terms of preparing students for this assessment, you may find the use of writing frames or templates useful. So for the test plan, it's a good idea for students to include brief overview or the purpose or scope of their testing plan. So for example, the purpose of this test plan is to support our IT users and to find the root cause of the whatever the issue happens to be. So adding something like this, and even their troubleshooting approach, like including something like the 5 whys or a fishbone diagram, can help students to focus their mind on the key issue. And similarly, with a template for the help guide for user instructions, and ensure students include images as well and highlighting any key areas, such as where users would need to click or check boxes and so on. And instead of you, the teacher, having to replicate faults yourself, you could have students try to create their own faults and make it even a competition as well. And whichever student creates a fault that's challenging and takes the most time to solve is the winner. Or you can share an error message or an image of a video, and students have to outline the steps they intend to take. So show the error message, and students then with a little video outline what settings they would go into, what they would do to try and resolve this issue. And in terms of instructions that are laid out, you could have students swap different steps and peer review each other, see how easy their instructions are to follow. And again, using something a little bit more interactive, if you were having a video response like Flipgrid, this is actually a video discussion and sharing app. So this is where you could record and maybe describe an error that has appeared on screen. And then students have to reply with a video showing exactly what settings they would go into and explaining how they would go about resolving the issue and finding out what the issue is. And for the test plan, you may find some of the occupational specialism resources useful, such as the exemplification materials for the network cabling assignment 3. And this shows the pass and distinction example of a test plan. What I've shown on screen right there is the distinction example of that test plan. So you may be able to use some aspects of these resources and adapt them for some of your employer set project preparation, such as showing students the pass example, getting them to comment with their positive points and development points. So what went well, even better if, and then share the distinction example for comparison. Now, to develop the skill of communicating with different audiences, such as technical audiences or a non-technical audience, you could have students produce a leaflet, presentation, or some other form of information package, but they have to produce ones for actually different audiences, such as for customers versus stakeholders, an IT user versus maybe an IT technician, etc. And this can help to develop those general competencies too. I'm going to hand over to David Seddon now. He's got some other suggestions for us.
Thanks, David. Yeah, for students on the cabling and infrastructure pathways, make sure students are familiar with things like topology diagrams. They can clearly look through a network diagram, and just by looking at the diagram, they can identify where potential problems or conflicts might be. Can they identify IP ranges and then apply the implementation of this? So do they understand how IP addressing works, and can they apply it to a network? For example, the ESP might highlight in the scenario a set amount of users that's required, and the configuration then shows the amount of IP addresses or a range that's available. So do they match up? And are students familiar with configuration information? So again, they might get configurations for the network. So in addition to the topology, working from that, can they then match up to the topology, match it up with the scenario, and then see how things jump out? For example, something not configured correctly or something having the wrong IP address between the three of them. And reading the scenario, going through that scenario, it'll highlight the issues themselves, and then they can back that up and reinforce it through comparing the diagrams. And that's key to it. Students need to be used to spending the time where they can compare all the information they've got. They can highlight anything that they think could be an issue. And even if what they've highlighted isn't an issue at that stage, there could still be marks available based on the justification of what they think the issue is and how they go about resolving it. And have they clearly explained the issue and the steps they take to resolve it? It's building confidence in the students that they can really justify and explain the reason, and they don't just stop at the first thing, because there might be more than one option available for resolving something. So the better that they can explain that, the reason, the resolution, that'll help to make sure that the test plan's better, because by that stage they'll clearly know what they're trying to test. For the digital support, similar things again, read the scenario and highlight issues. Same as mentioned with cabling and infrastructure, this is key. What can they pick out from the scenario that indicates there's a problem? Help desk role play is brilliant for that. It familiarizes them with how to find information out from listening about something or reading about something, and then what process they can take you through. So role playing a help desk, it gives them a chance to talk through a process. And consider creating a collaborative troubleshooting log that all the students can populate. It could be something that you've got on your college or sixth form VLE, where students can log in, and once they've had a problem or they've encountered something, they can jot down what the problem is and how they went about resolving it, all the steps that's involved with it. It gets them in good practice, because if they go into industry, we always log the problems. And if they're practicing it in class, it means that they're preparing themselves for the workplace. And at the same time, they're ending up with a brilliant revision guide that lets them read through and see some of the problems that they've worked through. Can the students record an incident or an issue? Do they know why they'd record an incident, how they go about doing it, and how they then test the issue? And at this point, they could demonstrate that they could have adapted the testing if it's required. And it's easy to read something and make an assumption based on reading the scenario, but have they then considered anything else that could be an issue? Perfect example, if the computer's not working, you're having a display problem, it could easily be identified to check the cables, but at the same time, it could be a driver issue. So there's not always one solution. It's have they thought about other things that could be causing them problems. How would they test something, and do they know what the expected results are? Testing something, if they know what the expected results are, it means that they'll then know how to test if it's working, which means the test plan will be more thorough. And do they know the process that they should be following? Familiarise them with looking at guidance. If you look through some of the sample ESPs or the one that went live this year, if you look through it, there might be an indicative format in there that he's recommended that they follow the format of how the test plan might look. And again, if they use that, it'll provide them with some basic formatting and a basic style guide. So get the students to try and at least cover all this so that they can think of how they're laying things out. And I think the key thing in both of them is that reading, identifying the problem, and then checking it against any additional files that they might get, such as the configuration files, so that they've got a clear idea of exactly what they're trying to address, what the issue is. The best way of supporting it in class is get them to do troubleshooting and resolve the problem. You know, it's easy to get them to troubleshoot when we're working with live equipment, but we do it not just with live problems, but with paper-based issues. You know, first 10 minutes of a session when they walk into a class, give everybody a paper-based task of a basic troubleshooting and see who can solve it but first and give you the most thorough resolution to it. Or do it as a group activity and then get them discussing what the issues are, what they've identified. So it can be just the first 10 minutes or the last 10 minutes of a session. Thanks, David.
Cheers. Thank you very much, David, for that. And we're now going to look at task 2 regarding the planning, their improvements, and the interview task. So task 2 is a simulated interview with more than likely the tutor playing the role described in the brief, such as the network manager. And this task is scheduled by yourselves, the provider, during the first assessment week. However, all students need to complete the interview task on the same day, and we will look at scheduling shortly to support you with that aspect. Now, this is an opportunity for students to gather further information via questioning to help them meet the aims of the brief. And it basically has 3 parts to it. Part 1 is preparing for the interview. And for this, students are to come up with the questions they should ask, and internet access is allowed for research purposes. Following this is the actual interview itself, with a tutor or someone that you select taking on the role of the network manager or whatever it happens to be as described in the brief. And you will be supplied as well with some supporting notes in order to support you with the possible questions that students may ask and responses to give. And this is audio recorded and lasts a maximum of 10 minutes. So just a 10-minute interview. So after the interview, students are then going to have 1 hour to compose 2 emails with a summary of their findings, and each email is going to have a different audience, such as a technical audience or a non-technical audience. And as I mentioned, there is going to be notes supplied in order to support you with this interview role play. And these notes should inform your responses to the students' questions. But do respond to the students' questions only, and don't volunteer additional information that is beyond the question they've asked. Now, it is entirely possible as well that students could ask you questions that you just can't answer. That's not supplied there on the brief. Now, what you can do though, if there's information there that you can logically construct from the information given, you can inform students of that. So in cases, if students have asked you a question that you actually can't answer, there's not significant information there, you can simply say to the students that you just don't have that information at hand. And it is a good idea to prepare students as well for that possible response. That way they'll know not to panic if it occurs. As some students may go into the interview with a preconceived idea of what they plan to do and focus their questioning maybe on that thought only. So it's important that if this happens, students should remain calm, and they may even think of a different relevant question instead, one which they didn't consider previously. Now, the interview is audio recorded and submitted as evidence, but students can't have access to this recording for the final hour when they're actually composing their emails. So it's really important that students make accurate notes during the interview. So they may want to include some quick input headings on their question sheet. Headings like operating system, number of computers, and so on, depending, of course, on the brief and the information needed. Now, as all students do need to sit this assessment on the same day, you may find it best to use a staggered timetabling approach to aid with that delivery. So the table shows an example of how this scheduling could work. So with the first student, student A, arriving at 9 a.m. in order to prepare their interview questions for that first hour. And then we have our second student, student B, just arriving 20 minutes later. And then student C, 20 minutes after that, and so on. It's 20-minute gaps between our scheduling. Now, if we look back at student A, at 10 a.m., that's when they will begin their 10-minute audio recorded interview in a different room. And this will be with the tutor. So make sure you have your recording equipment ready. And when student A has finished, they can then return to that very first room they began in when they were doing their research in order to write up their emails. And this is where that scheduling of 20-minute gaps is useful, as this will give the tutor 10 minutes crossover time for saving the audio recording and preparing for the next students. And this is just a recommendation, of course. You can decrease or increase that crossover by changing the staggering timetable accordingly. So here, for example, with more tutors involved, then the quicker you can actually deliver this task as well to your students. So here on this second table, we have the same staggering scheduling, but 2 tutors involved with the role play, twice as many students getting assessed in the same time. Now, remember as well, before actually taking on the next student, do make sure you use that 10 minutes buffer time, that crossover time, to have a quick check of the recording as well. So make sure just it's fully recorded, start, middle, end, just quick checks that it can be heard and so on. So obviously you don't have to play the full thing, few checks just to make sure it has fully recorded. And if not, best to try and do a re-record with that student if you can, and make NCFE aware as well. Now here are the highlights of the positives and developmental areas noted for the Summer 22 ESP. And this includes notes as well on how the providers performed. So the chief examiner noted that there was reasonable and good use of communication techniques with the questions that the students actually developed. And some provider positives were around the realism of the interview, when tutors would reword and paraphrase the information rather than just stating directly the information that we provided on the notes. And those tutors who actually answered students' questions, which weren't, explicitly stated on the notes. So rather than say answering with, I don't have that information, those tutors and providers instead gave answers using some of the logically created information from the notes, where that was possible. Of course, it's not always possible, but sometimes you can infer and work out from the information, logically create answers to those questions. Some developmental areas for the students were around adaptability, as many students stuck too rigidly to their prepared questions and therefore missed out on some of the opportunities for more information by not utilizing some active listening techniques. And for providers, it was more about the balance. So some providers were volunteering information beyond the scope of the question that was actually posed by the student. And then at other times, too little information was given to relevant questions asked by the students. So for the email portion of the task, some students did show an ability to communicate to different audiences, so the technical and non-technical audiences, but some emails lacked depth and the information provided was superficial. So there wasn't a demonstration of that problem solving and analytical thinking in their response, with a lack of relevant terminology too at times. So as this task, terminology and the ability to communicate with different audiences is quite a key part of this and the core skills, it might be useful to get students thinking about this right from the start. So you could issue students with like a key terms list to use throughout your T-level delivery. And this just gets added to as you go with different relevant terms. So you'll end up with a glossary, which includes a technical description though of that term, but also a non-technical description. And I've just given a simple example there with the term IP address. So during any lesson where communication to different audiences is important, students could use this sheet as a resource for practicing that communication skill. During the assessment, there are a few tips you can give to students to help them to make the most of their time and actually, hopefully, improve their outcomes as well. So during the 1 hour interview prep time, students should consider maybe breaking up their technical questions into smaller parts. So for example, instead of phrasing a question like this, tell me about your servers and their operating system, they could use some smaller questions instead, such as how many servers do you have? What are the roles of those servers? What's the operating system on the servers? And this should allow some more staggered note-taking during the interview. So students shouldn't feel as pressured or rushed when actually recording the answers. And this can also actually serve as a double check for students as well, as they'll be able to see more easily if they've gathered the relevant information needed. The students can also make a bit of clever use of that question sheet by adding any relevant fields or tables, which can help to facilitate and improve their note-taking as well during the interview. And they might want to consider some more open-ended questions when exploring the client's requirements and changes that they might need implemented. So if students asked a closed question, such as how many staff will need access to the network remotely, then the answer there would be quite limited from yourself, as you'll probably just give the number required. Now, this also doesn't give much, if any, opportunities for exploring different requirements and determining what's most important either on the student's half. Whereas if they had phrased it a bit more as an open question, such as what improvements or requirements would you like to see for accessing the network remotely? A question like that will allow for exploration, as the answer that you give might include aspects like managing and controlling the remote network, remote access to files, other remote solutions like cloud storage, etc. So students actually might gain a greater insight from an open question like this, which can then be followed up with more closed questions if necessaries. You know, an example of an extra question about remote access, for example, it might be if this would be needed for all staff, would it be needed in all locations? So those smaller closed questions then could be followed up. Then during the actual 10-minute interview, it is best if students actually take the lead on this, as it is the students interviewing you. And you can provide some like starter lines to students when practicing and preparing them for the live assessment. For example, hello, David Seddon. My name is David Kiernan, and thanks for taking the time to meet me. I just have a few questions to better understand the problems you're facing, your current setup, and your requirements, to help me put an appropriate solution in place. So a simple sentence like that to help your students practice an opening line. Now, even though you can do that with students, you may have some who are more reserved or maybe not quite as confident yet, or a bit nervous about starting off the interview. So in which case you can open the interview, but you can still put the onus back onto the students. So for example, another way that could be phrased is, hello, David, I'm the network manager, and I understand you have some questions for me so that you can better understand what our systems are like, the problems we have, and what we require from our network. So this way, you've just phrased it, you've started off the interview, but you've straight away put the onus on the students. That's them that's going to be asking you questions and interviewing you. And students should also try and demonstrate active listening during the interview. And they shouldn't worry about sticking too rigidly, as the chief examiner mentioned, to their questions, because that could miss those opportunities to explore options. And students should also ensure that they clarify anything during the interview that they may not have heard correctly or might have misunderstood. And just simply asking, would you mind repeating that, please, is sufficient for students to say. So, and summarizing or double checking, that's the most really useful method actually for showing active listening. And it can be used in conjunction with that very first tip of using smaller technical questions, as this will allow for a recap at the end to show active listening. For example, a student might say, can I confirm then, is that 3 servers in total, 1 domain, 1 VPN, and 1 file and print server, and they all have a Windows operating system, but not the same version. Something like that, little summary, recaps like this can be really, really useful for students, not only to demonstrate that active listening, but also ensure they have the relevant information needed and recorded correctly. Following the interview then, students will need to compose 2 emails summarizing their findings, but these emails are for different audiences. So coupled with the glossary of technical and non-technical definitions that I mentioned earlier as a possible method for preparing students, you could also provide some guidance for students when they're actually preparing for the live assessments and preparing their emails. So this table gives a summary of some aspects to think about and examples to help guide students in preparation for the live one, such as considering whether it's an informal email, such as maybe to their own line manager, or is it much more formal, such as to the client or CEO, and their use of that technical language or any technical jargon in the email, and whether some context might be needed to be given, especially for a non-technical audience, implying some context so they can fully understand. I'm going to hand over now to David Seddon for some extra suggestions for us.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that glossary is a good idea. I mean, getting students to put together a glossary, a collaborative one that they can all feed into, having a technical and non-technical description, again, makes a brilliant revision resource. Also, some of the things that kind of jumped out was familiarizing students with asking questions. Use role-play in class, get role-play activities going where they're working in groups. When you're presenting to the students, make sure that they're questioning what you're telling them. They're not just taking the information in, but they're starting to quiz you on, well, why is this happening? What's this? Try to bring in guest speakers. And I know it's not easy getting guest speakers always, but you could use your own IT department. You could get them to come in. You could have students question them then about the school or the college infrastructure. And you could maybe set them up a group challenge, seeing who can find out the most information from that guest speaker. You could split the class into 2 groups and get each group to interview the guest speaker and then see who can find out the most useful information about the network and how the IT team work. So you're getting them used to that questioning. The ability to adapt questions based on feedback, so they gain a better understanding of the issue. Sometimes we can find something out, but that also raises additional questions. So it's that digging deeper. Make sure that students are confident in adapting to this, so it gets them delving deeper and using questioning techniques in class. So when you're giving them information and they question you, don't give them a definitive answer, make them build on it and keep building them questions in so that they're always trying to get you to answer it in more depth. Are the questions that students asking, are they clear? Are they really getting the information that they want? In class, if a student asks you something and it's not that clear, then don't answer it. Make them expand on what they want until they clearly get across the point of the information they're after. and then make a point of highlighting how they could have done that easier by just adapting the question that they started with in the first case. And do they use open questioning? You know, as a teacher, we all do this when we're formatively assessing, and it's not easy. It's a hard technique to master. So help students understand the technique by highlighting it when you're doing it. And do they listen to the response and then adapt based on it? You know, as I said before, get them to delve deeper and not just take that first answer. You can build this skill by not always giving them too much information to start with, and then say to them, what else do you need to know? Or have you got everything that you need? What would help you? As David mentioned, I mean, technical terminology is key. They've got to be able to use the right terminology. So make sure they're using it in class. And if they don't, if they describe something, ask them what it is, or if they give you technical terms, ask them what it means. You know, simple crossword activities at the start of a session might help them then to remember keywords. And then they need to then look at how they could translate that into language that a non-technical person might understand. If they can do all that, then putting the email together should be fairly straightforward. And if you use the last 10 minutes of a session to get them to post a summary of your class, of your lesson, onto maybe a class discussion board, or they could just send an email to you summarising the session. It could be something like what they liked, what they didn't like, some new terminology that they've learned in that session, or even something that wasn't that clear but they want you to recap. And that way you're getting them in the habit of writing that email and sending information through, and focus on the difference between technical and non-technical. So as they're sending email through, if it's then non-technical the way they're wording it, you can always then support them from how could I word that better? And if they are wording it very technical, you could get them to think about, well, how could I break that down and make it a bit easier for people to understand exactly what I'm trying to say? Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David, for that. Task 3 is the project proposal. And in task 3, this is going to be happening on a fixed date and time in the second week of the assessment window. And this task is the opportunity for students to put their proposal together based on the information gathered during the interview. Now, students are also issued with a document which will look practically identical to the interview support notes that you actually had. And the reason is to ensure that no student is disadvantaged from the interview portion of the task. In case some students didn't ask relevant questions, for example, then this document ensures that all students have all the same relevant information. Now, as this task is over 3 hours long, students are entitled to a rest break. And this must be supervised and last a maximum of 15 minutes. And students are to create a detailed proposal, which can include a summary of the problem and their solution, if any resources are needed, such as equipment and software, and why these resources are needed and what is the cost, and any security issues and long-term solutions. And this can include diagrams as well, such as a network diagram for the network cabling and digital infrastructure ESP. Now, some of the positives found in the summer series was the consideration of the cybersecurity issues. Students had shown good consideration of this overall. However, the Chief Examiner did find that the information provided in their project proposal didn't incorporate the full scope of the brief. Often students would duplicate resources. For example, purchase multiple expensive servers, as well as recommending a full cloud solution. But what was lacking was describing the purpose of each component. For any network diagrams, the Chief Examiner found that they often lacked the detail required, such as clearly showing and identifying any VPN, servers, cloud resources, PCs, etc., which is needed to gain those higher marks. This task also had a maths element to it, and some positives were the inclusion of tables with resources, quantities, costings, etc. However, some additional care is needed, as some students missed out on marks due to just some simple calculation errors, or even by not performing some simple calculations, such as adding up the total costs. Another aspect highlighted was students missing the difference in units, such as having costs in a mix of British pounds and US dollars. So just a quick example here in order to help prepare your students for the live assessment is another example of maybe a writing frame that could be given with some support and information to help students practice. So I've used some generic headings on here, but putting the introduction and the current issues in there can really help to ensure students don't go off on a tangent, and they can focus on the needs of the client and on the brief. And another aspect is in the resources section, and it's definitely good practice to highlight the cost that would be a one-off cost and which would actually be recurring costs, such as subscriptions to cloud services. So a little template like this, some guidance points, may be useful when you're actually preparing your students too. And I'm going to hand over to David again. He's got some extra teaching and learning strategies for us.
As I mentioned before, it's that reading the scenario and getting students used to highlighting things in the scenario, you know, issues in there and requirements. As mentioned before, they need to be used to reading the scenario and clearly then highlighting the key information. The sooner they can highlight that key information, the easier it gets. Use case studies in class. Get them used to reading documents, highlighting points in it, and understanding what it contains. You know, classroom discussions based around whatever the findings are from the case study. If required, supportive documentation is included and accurate if they've got to produce anything. So same as David mentioned about things not adding up or calculations. Do they need to supply additional supportive documents? You know, do they need things, network diagrams or information about networks? And if they do, can they do that? Do they know what the information is that they need to include? You know, if possible, use things like Packet Tracer so that they're familiar with visualizing how a network looks on paper, because that'll give them that idea of looking at something and seeing where problems are right and how things are working. Provide clear recommendations based on the requirements. You know, have they addressed all the issues? Going back and checking that whatever the solution they're putting in place, has that met all the recommendations? And also sometimes considering as a recommendation that they've introduced caused other issues. You know, it's about demonstrating that they understand the scenario and they can offer a realistic suggestion based on this. Back to that 10-minute starter task at the end of a session, you know, or at the end of a session, get them to see who can resolve an issue based on a help desk ticket. At the start of the session, you might put out a batch of help desk tickets, like the students take one in the way around. They could discuss it in 2s, 3s, and then talk about what solutions they've put in place. And that way they might see that the solution they're coming up with, other students are addressing the same problem, but from a different way. And that way they'll start to see there's always more than one solution possible. Are they providing mitigation for the issue? There might be other things that students could highlight in the scenario that hasn't been explicitly mentioned. So can they describe it? Can they explain how they do, what they mitigate and why they do it? For example, if all users had local rights, what would be the issues and how could they mitigate that? And can they articulate that solution? Can they clearly say what they want to say? They may well know what's required, but can they put it into words that make sense in both a technical and a non-technical way? As mentioned before, emails summarising the session that you're doing, or having discussion boards or wikis or whatever tool your college or school uses, something that they're constantly getting in the habit of responding to something technically and non-technically. You know, sometimes the easiest is the best, a post-it note that they can write on the way out, not putting other barriers in the path, so that you're getting to see how clearly they can write a paragraph at the end of a session that explains what they've learned today, and they can hand it in and get easy marks and feedback on what they're going to say, and don't just provide one solution that's available. Provide a wider range that demonstrates the technical understanding. Thanks, David.
Cheers, David. Thank you very much for that. On to the very final task now, which is the self-review and evaluation. So task 4 takes place in the remaining days of the second assessment week, those remaining 4 days. And this is provider scheduled, and students don't need to complete this task simultaneously, which means that any absent students could be caught up in the remainder of the assessment window. And this task is 3.5 hours, and as it's over 3 hours, students are entitled to a 15-minute supervised rest break. And students are to create a professionally styled and formatted satisfaction survey for the audience described in the brief, such as the end user, in order to determine how effective their solution has been. And students should consider the questions they ask and the audience of this survey, choosing a range of question types that can gather both qualitative and quantitative information as appropriate. Students are also to create a post-project review document, which will be a student self-evaluation of their performance on the ESP tasks. This document can include an overview of the key issues identified and the solutions offered by the students, how they have considered security issues and mitigations, and an evaluation of their own performance and any areas that need more development. Students are allowed access to copies of their previous ESP materials and evidence, apart from the interview audio recording. And it must be copies of their previous evidence, and that should be kept separate from the originals. So this is to ensure that students don't make any changes to their actual previous evidence. Now, some of the positives noted by the Chief Examiner for the satisfaction survey were where students use a range of different questions and different question types, allowing them to gather key qualitative information and some quantitative data too. But some students didn't fully consider their survey audience and had some questions more for the managers or those involved with the solution, rather than the end user, which is what was needed for that particular ESP. For the post-project review document, most students were able to demonstrate a reasonable understanding of the key issues given in the scenario, their solution, mitigations, and security factors. Some students, though, struggled to review how well their outcomes and solutions would meet the needs of the brief, which means they couldn't get those marks due to struggling on how to approach the review. So as mentioned previously, when I spoke about the general competencies, English has also been noted by the Chief Examiner as an area for development, as some students missed out on marking for tasks 2, 3, and 4 due to spelling, punctuation, and grammar errors. So I'm just going to hand over to David Seddon one more time for some suggestions for this task for preparing your students.
For the satisfaction survey, question types, are they using a range of qualitative and quantitative techniques? You know, for example, are they asking to rate something and then explain why? And has technical and non-technical been considered when doing the scenario? And would they know how to adapt questions based on that? Key, are the questions relevant and are they related to the scenario? For example, there might be a scenario such as a post-project review based on your recommendations and an end survey end user satisfaction survey and instructions for them to consider when writing the review or survey. So they might have to think about, this is a scenario, but in relation to the scenario, have we thought about ease of use, accessibility of resources, ability to communicate, teamwork, and that type of thing. So making sure that they tie it all in. In relation to the review, have they explained key issues, justified solutions, use relevant terminology? And again, it's that technical and non-technical. Can they communicate both ways? And evaluated their own performance of the task. There's nothing new here. The key thing is written communication, preparing students so they can clearly and articulately explain and reflect on the project. They may need to be prepared to adapt what they've done and adapt that based on the target audience. So preparing them in sessions to take if you got the students and give them a technical case study or an online technical article and get the student to convert it into a non-technical document. Once they've converted the document, they could get one of their peers to then read the document and try and convert that back into a document for a technical audience. And then finally, if you compared the original document to what you've ended up with, how close are they? Are they still painting the same picture, or has things been lost in translation? So it gets them used to how terminology can be adapted, and are they using it in the right context? Thanks, David.
Excellent, David. Thank you very much for those suggestions. And actually, thank you very much for your support during today's webinar. And I would like to thank everyone here for viewing today's session. I hope you have indeed found it useful and that you feel a bit more confident and better prepared for the expectations of the Employer Set project. And from everyone here at NCFE, we'd like to wish you a very enjoyable and a very successful year. Thank you.